In 1979, Iran replaced a dictatorship with a theocracy. 45 years later, it remains one of the most economically isolated countries on Earth. Not because of incompetence, not because of resource scarcity, but because a religious system tried to govern an economy by principles written 1,400 years ago. This is theocracy, and today we're examining why when priests make economic policy, the results are always the same: stagnation, isolation, and eventual collapse. Welcome back to the real economic truth. A theocracy is a government where religious authority and political authority are one and the same. A priest, a cleric, a religious council, they don't just advise the government, they are the government. They don't just interpret scripture, they write laws based on it. Theocracies come in different forms. In the Vatican, the Pope is both spiritual and temporal leader. In Iran, the supreme leader is both religious authority and head of state. In Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, Islamic law is state law. But they all share one fundamental characteristic. Economic decisions are made by people whose expertise is theology, not economics. Now, here's what makes theocracy economically unique. Every other system we've examined, democracy, autocracy, oligarchy, these systems can theoretically pursue any economic policy. They might choose poorly, they might fail, but they can choose. A theocracy can't. It is constrained by doctrine, by scripture, by what religious texts say about money, interest, profit, and commerce. And because these texts were written in pre-industrial societies, they often contradict the requirements of modern economies. The most economically significant theocracy is Iran, and the most economically significant constraint in Islamic law is the prohibition on riba, which is translated as interest or usury. In Islamic theology, charging interest on a loan is forbidden, period. The Quran explicitly prohibits it. Hadith condemns it. Islamic scholars have spent centuries debating what this means, but the core principle is unchanging. Money should not breed money through lending. This creates an immediate problem. Modern economies run on credit. Banks don't exist to store money. They exist to lend it. A bank that can't charge interest is not a bank, it's a vault. And an economy that can't access credit is an economy that can't grow. When Iran imposed strict Islamic finance rules, they didn't eliminate banking. They created something called Islamic banking. The structure is clever. Instead of a loan with interest, the bank becomes a partner in the venture. If you want to start a factory, the bank doesn't lend you money at 8% interest. Instead, the bank buys the factory and you pay the bank a share of profits. Theoretically, this creates alignment. The bank profits only if the business succeeds. In practice, it creates bureaucracy, it creates uncertainty, it creates delays. And in a global economy where capital moves at the speed of electronic transfer, delays mean death. The result? Iran's banking system is dysfunctional. Foreign investment has collapsed. Iranians with capital send it abroad, to Dubai, to Turkey, anywhere the returns are predictable and the system is familiar. The capital that should be building Iranian factories is being invested in foreign real estate. Meanwhile, Iran's economy stagnates. GDP per capita in Iran is 1/3 of what it was before the revolution, not because of war, though there was a devastating war, not because of corruption, though there is corruption, but because the economic system is constrained by a religious principle written in the 7th century. The Vatican is a theocracy that offers an interesting contrast. Unlike Iran, the Vatican has no oil, no agriculture, no natural resources whatsoever. It is a city-state of roughly 1,000 citizens, 90% of whom are clergy. Yet the Vatican has remained economically stable for centuries. Why? Because the Vatican doesn't try to run a modern economy. It runs a medieval one. The Vatican's economy is almost entirely based on donations, tourism, and investment income. It doesn't manufacture, it doesn't export, it doesn't compete. It simply collects wealth and preserves it. In this, the Vatican is economically rational. A priest making economic policy has no expertise in manufacturing or trade, so the Vatican doesn't try. But this creates a different problem. The Vatican is not an economy, it's a museum. It works because it's small, because it's static, and because the world sends it money voluntarily. Scale this model to a nation of 80 million people, as Iran tried to do, and it collapses. The lesson of the Vatican is that theocracy can succeed. It's that theocracy succeeds only when it makes no attempt to function as a modern economy. The moment a theocracy tries to compete in global markets, to manufacture, to innovate, to grow, it fails. In August 2021, the Taliban took control of Afghanistan and immediately began implementing Islamic law. Markets froze, foreign investment disappeared. The Afghan currency lost half its value in months. Women, who had made up a quarter of Afghanistan's workforce, were barred from most employment. The economic impact was immediate. Removing a quarter of your workforce while maintaining theocratic control over the remaining three-quarters is economically catastrophic. But here's what's important. The Taliban didn't make this choice because it was economically rational. They made it because Islamic theology, as they interpret it, requires it. The economy was not the priority. Theology was. This is the fundamental difference between a theocracy and every other system. In an autocracy, the leader will modify policy if it causes economic collapse, because economic collapse threatens the leader's power. In a democracy, voters will throw out governments that wreck the economy. But in a theocracy, if the economy collapses because of theological requirements, the theological requirements don't change. The economy does. Or, more accurately, it shrinks until it aligns with what theology permits. One pattern emerges from every theocracy we examine: economic isolation. Iran is isolated. Afghanistan, under the Taliban, is isolated. Medieval theocracies were isolated. This happens for a simple reason. Global trade requires trust. Trust requires common legal frameworks, common currency standards, common assumptions about property rights and contracts. When a government is willing to overturn contracts if they violate religious law, trust evaporates. A multinational corporation will not invest in a country where the government might confiscate property because Scripture says property holding violates Islamic principles. A bank will not lend to a country where the government might refuse repayment because interest is forbidden. The result is that theocracies are locked out of global capital markets. They must rely on internal resources. They must rely on trade with other theocracies, or with countries desperate enough to trade with them anyway. And they must accept much lower growth rates than economically open societies. Iran could theoretically modify Islamic finance rules. It has the theological expertise. It has the religious scholars. But doing so would require admitting that modern economics requires departing from 7th century doctrine. And that admission undermines the theocracy's core legitimacy, that religious law is timeless, universal, and superior to human reason. So Iran doesn't change. The economy stagnates, and the theocracy survives by becoming less and less relevant to the actual lives of its citizens. Theocracy is not just a religious system, it is an economic system. And as an economic system, it has never sustained growth, innovation, or prosperity at scale. The question isn't whether theocracies are morally right or wrong. The question is whether they can survive in a world where economic competition determines which nations rise and which nations fall. History suggests the answer is no.